the Soviet Union when we were Stalinists without knowing that we were Stalinists, and without knowing very much about Stalinism, was given so much emphasis, it was not because it was Russia we were in love with, a nation state called Russia. It was because the Soviet Union was supposed to be the workers' fatherland, is the way it was called, or more precisely, that area of the world that had been emancipated. And when I was in the Young Pioneers of America, a communist children's organization, we would raise our hands, our palm over our ears, and the 5 fingers represented 5/6 of the world that were not conquered by socialism, because Russia at that time was regarded as 1/6 of the landmass of the world. But it was not a devotion to Russia as such. And we would have felt that way. We were as deeply involved in Spain as we were involved in anything during the 1930s as we were involved in anything that was happening in Detroit. We were as passionately involved in Madrid and Barcelona as we would have been passionately involved in the general strike that occurred in 1934 in San Francisco or in Minneapolis, where the Trotskyists had a very strong Teamsters union, or were getting one. That internationalism suffused us completely. We didn't sit around and babble endlessly about our cultural identity. We were concerned with humanity first. And any cultural identity, which must be given due recognition insofar as the people have their own folklore, their own traditions, their own language, their own poetry, their own music, was secondary to our affinity as a species called human beings. So that was the left that existed. And that left underwent terrible decay. With the new left, and I'm sorry to say that, because however imaginative the new left was initially, however much it emphasized alienation, which required emphasis, however much it spoke to the notions of imagination, and at that time, imagination did not mean necessarily anything demonic. Imagination at that point was an imagination informed by the rationality of socialism or anarchism. The emphasis on the third world that began to capture the new left made it not only very similar with its Maoism and its Castroism and its Ho Chi Minhism to the old left, but worse. It deprived the new left of any kind of critical spirit and made it more dogmatic. Now, for these new lefties who've become professors, professionals, whatever you like, and for young people who think they're imitating the new left and the so-called counterculture, which turned increasingly into the New Age, as we all know, to invoke the idea that the left is dead is a double crime. It's squaring the mistakes they made in the late 60s when they became Maoists. And not only that, poisoning the atmosphere they had already begun to poison after 1968 with their Maoism, their fanaticism, their dogmatism, their misinterpretation even of Marxism, degrading Marxism itself and turning it into a new form of Stalinism. Now for them to say, well, we are now weeping in their teacup, and we are now disillusioned. What have we done with our lives? It's time to become a dentist. It's time to become a professor. Or if we are a professor, it's time to become a postmodernist. And that is infuriating. We need to recreate a left again based on left libertarian principles. I don't care what you want to call it. I don't care whether you want to call it anarchism or whether you want to call it libertarian socialism or libertarian communism. Many people do not know, incidentally, that the Spanish anarchists in 1890 were seriously considering dropping the word anarchism because it was so broad as to include any kind of individual insanity, and were prepared to call themselves libertarian communists. That was a serious debate that occurred in the Spanish anarchist movement. People don't know that. And I propose to discuss that in a forthcoming work. But the point is, I don't care what ism you want to call it in that sense. It has to be minimally a socialism. I use the word in the broadest possible sense, that Kropotkin's, in the sense that Kropotkin called anarchism a form of socialism, or Bakunin called anarchism a form of socialism? And the reason why I'm using that word is not because I've become a socialist in any traditional sense at all. I'm using that word because there are now forms of so-called leftism, so-called anarchism, and even so-called socialism that are getting into the postmodernist trip of expressing my desire, emancipating myself in some bunghole someplace with either acid or an ecstatic vision, and then going back into the capitalist society after you take a bath. Hakim Bey has come out with temporary autonomous zones, where ostensibly, if you go ahead and you find your inner self and you give full expression to your desire, no expression of socialism, you understand. That's only marginal. You, your ego, your little bourgeois ego, will express itself imaginatively, as though imagination does not produce monsters as well, as Francisco Goya saw, when he declared that the sleep of reason produces monsters, and wrote, which nobody ever reads, that what he means by that is that when imagination is let loose without being informed by reason, it does produce monsters, as witness Nuremberg rallies, as witness the shenanigans and the drama, the Wagnerian dramas of the Nazis, and of Wagner himself, who I really regard as a proto-Nazi, in spite of the fact that I think there's a magnificence in his music. So what I'm saying now is that we have to reconstitute a left again. And we have to reconstitute a left without claiming any pedigree in the so-called Russian Revolution, which tragically was a coup d'etat by the Bolsheviks, meant to start a revolution in Europe, not to establish socialism in Russia, but which Stalin took over and turned into a form of red, quotes, fascism. The future of the left today lies in the recognition that insofar as there's a right out there and there's a libertarian, independent tradition, which is reflected not only by writers like Bakunin or Kropotkin, but by many socialists, including many Marxists of the past. We have to recover that tradition, transcend both the new left and the old left, and not go into liberalism as the center's doing, and as many so-called socialist periodicals are doing, but retain above all not only these basic 5 or so precepts that constitute the left: radical democracy, communism, and with that the overthrow of capitalism. And not only that, recognizing the need for technological development that is sane and rational, and in addition to that, thinking of a communist response to the present overabundance that we have, that is being kept from the people, the enforced scarcity that exists today as a result of a market economy. But we have, in addition to that, to transcend both the old left and the new left into a truly new left that is uncompromising in its opposition to capitalism, does not accept myths like market socialism, which I regard as an oxymoron. The two words contradict each other. That tries to develop the potential that existed in the new left of the 60s, and which was quickly destroyed, and the potential that existed in the counterculture, and the potential that existed, all of which were quickly destroyed, and the potential that existed in feminism, which had been perverted in recent memory. And the idea of informing a new theory and creating a new movement. Because if I could put together all the people who say, oh, I'm still a socialist, but I don't believe it's possible in my lifetime or in some other lifetime, as though socialism means that it has to be achieved in your lifetime. Being a socialist means that it has to be achieved in your lifetime. I would have a mass movement, or at least I'd be able to belong to a mass movement. There are so many of them walking around being disillusioned. So that's what I mean by the traditions of the left, the present day situation of the left today, and the future of the left. But left there must be, right there is.
You mentioned the term postmodernism several times. We live in an age of seeming relativism and irrationality, yet you seem to maintain a belief in rationality and reason, and have a belief in civilization and also progress. Why is that?
Needless to say, of course, as I indicated, this is part of the tradition of what has been called the left that was. The French Revolution and the Enlightenment, I may add, all the way up, to give or take the 1970s and 80s. And I really think that this requires some explication, some understanding. In the first place, rationality, in my opinion, unlike a Nietzsche and a Heidegger and a Foucault and the rest of that crowd, rationality to me, first of all, does not mean simple A plus B equals C rationality, or the law of identity A equals A. I am basically very much influenced by Hegel, although I'm not, in any sense of the word, I'm not a Hegelian, clearly not. Reason, however, can be viewed from two standpoints. The reason that you require, the conventional analytical reason you require to build a bridge, to build a house, to check your bank balance and whatever you like. That is the ordinary instrumental reason that we do need for everyday life. We can't do without it. That instrumental reason also appears as should be called, I've called it conventional reason, in our everyday affairs. On the other hand, there is a much more overarching way of thinking, an overarching and broader way of thinking, which I would call dialectical reason. And that overarching way of thinking, which does not have to culminate in an absolute, as Hegel's logic culminates. It does not have to culminate in a totality, which means the end of everything, in a sense, or the completion of everything. And then afterward, there is no basis for thinking about any further historical development. You just go back in a circle again. That circularity that comes with totality. And that form of reasoning, or logic, is based on the idea that what exists is always becoming and undergoing transformation. In contrast to the formal or instrumental or conventional logic, which has to take things as very fixed. Now, both rationalities are necessary, in my opinion, for understanding the world. Just as I believe you would have to use Einstein to understand larger cosmic astrophysical processes, and just as you would have to use Newton, on the other hand, to understand more microscopic, I use the word microscopic in contrast to vastly cosmic, mundane, everyday realities. And I would suggest that if one talks about reason, one is talking about how the world is developing from a dialectical standpoint, how it is unfolding. And when one talks about that, one runs into a great many questions. What are the potentialities of human beings? Here we are, products of natural evolution, unquestionably so, whose main capacity, besides thinking as well as making, using our fingers and our eyes, thanks to stereoscopic vision and the opposable thumb, capable of intervening in the world, begin to differ from other animals insofar as, through our intelligence and through our capacity to learn beyond that of any other animal, these are given to us by natural evolution. It's not that some artificer came in and endowed us with this. This emerges out of our mammalian, our primate evolution, are now capable not simply of adapting to the world, but of innovating. So that innovation is a fundamental capacity of being human. It's a fundamental trait. To intervene into the world, to engage in a practice that goes beyond the everyday life of eating, fornicating, defecating, whatever you like, and playing,